Now, David Cameron will be spending most of next week in India. He said last week that he likes his curries pretty hot. The main reason for his trip is to try and boost British business. The government now defines relations with India in terms of trade rather than aid. It announced last year that aid programs to India would be phased out by 2015. Some critics have argued that was premature. Others question why the government is increasing an aid budget at all, overall at a time of cuts in basic services at home. Susanna Mendonça has been weighing up the arguments.
Packed up and ready to go. This is Oxfam's Rapid Response Centre in Bicester, Oxfordshire. If there's a humanitarian disaster somewhere in the world, these boxes full of supplies get shipped out.
All of this could be used in programmes funded by the Department for International Development, and David Cameron's made clear that he sees foreign aid as a priority for his government. But should we be spending so much on it at a time of austerity?
Government spending on overseas aid has jumped from £8.7 billion last year to £11.3 billion this year. That's in line with its commitment to spend 0.7% of national income on aid by 2013, a UN target which the UK has now reached. But with countries like India, which has its own space programme on the receiving end of British aid, the Prime Minister has faced calls from his own backbenchers to change course. In November, the government announced it would end all financial aid to India in 2015, a decision that left-leaning think tank IPPR has blamed on right-wing pressure. But one former Tory Chancellor says Britain needs to cut back.
Because we take this target seriously, we are giving more in aid than any other country in Europe. Indeed, more in aid than any other country in the world, with the exception of the United States, which is of course very much richer and very much larger than we are. And it makes no sense whatever, particularly at a time of financial stringency, when a lot of important public expenditure programs in this country are having to be cut back with great damage to the poor.
UN figures show that 16 out of 23 developed nations cut the amount of money that they were spending on aid back in 2011, mainly as a result of the economic crisis.
But here, David Cameron has continually defended aid spending.
Now, I know that some are sceptical about our aid budget, but picture the scene. You're in a health centre in Kinshasa. See the child with the needle in her arm being injected with a yellow fever vaccine. That is the difference between living and dying. How can anyone tell me that is a waste of money?
And aid agencies like Oxfam agree.
So these tanks and buckets are going out to help 120,000 people who've had to flee the conflict in Syria. After a humanitarian crisis, one of the biggest dangers is dirty water. It can kill you. This type of technology really keeps people alive.
But there is concern that some of the money perhaps that the government's sending out to foreign countries isn't going to the right places. How do we know that we're getting value for money?
I've seen for myself the difference that aid makes in Africa and Asia. 12 million kids used to die every year before the age of 5. Now that's down to 7 million. So 5 million kids won't die this year, and that's in part because of aid. So that really is value for money.
With David Cameron calling on the UN this month to set new goals to put an end to extreme poverty by 2030, the debate over how much we put into foreign aid isn't going away.
And Justin Forsyth, the Chief Executive of Save the Children, and author and journalist Jonathan Foreman go head to head. Jonathan Foreman, we heard aid workers saying in the film there that our aid is saving the lives of millions of young African children. What's wrong with that?
Well, what's wrong with that, Andrew, is that it's not entirely true we have saved certain numbers of children, but the aid industry and DFID tend to trot out these very large numbers that are unprovable, like so much in aid. And that often aren't true. I mean, for instance, vaccination, which is what the Prime Minister always refers to, less than 1% of our aid budget goes to vaccination. You could cut 95% of it and you'd still be saving those children.
What do you say to that?
I just don't think that's true. A huge amount of our aid budget goes towards vaccination, it goes towards girls' education, it goes towards training frontline midwives. And
he says 1% goes to vaccination. How much do you say?
So in 2011, I think the UK government made a pledge of over, I think, 500 million over a few years for vaccination. That one intervention intervention that the British Prime Minister made in 2011 will vaccinate nearly 4 million children in the next few years, and already has saved 1 million children's lives. So we know that vaccination has made a big difference. I mean, we had the biggest fall in history last year in the number of children that die from preventable illnesses like diarrhea and pneumonia. This is a huge success story.
But again,
and what we
let him come back in.
I think vaccination is probably one of the most effective forms of aid that we do. But again, it's tiny. We're talking about an aid budget of 11 billion, whereas even if it was 100 million, it's very, very small compared to the overall budget. And most of our aid doesn't go to that. It's not small
if you're one of the 250 million children that have been vaccinated in the last few years, and many of them are alive today, haven't died of diarrhea and pneumonia. Now, the British public...
His point is you don't need 11 billion to do that. You maybe need a couple of hundred.
And some of that money can be used for people who
what do you say to that?
We're just talking about vaccination, which is one intervention, but across the board, we've made more progress than any other point in history in lifting people out of poverty, getting children into school, stopping children dying of diarrhea and pneumonia.
A lot of this is just marketing rhetoric. A lot of what's lifted people out of poverty.
Hold on, you got to let him speak.
A lot of people, what's lifted people is economic growth has done that, and that hasn't come out of foreign aid. I mean, the economic growth in India that's raised people out of poverty is to do with homegrown development. It's to do with businesses. It's to do with people making money. It isn't because of the money that we've put in that's been taken by officials all over the world. I mean, as everyone knows within the aid business, it's a very difficult thing to do foreign aid.
You polarise the debate to make it an either-or, but I completely agree. Growth plays a big part. Also, taxation. The Chancellor made a very important intervention today, and the Prime Minister is going to push this at the GA. But aid targeted on education, on health, on vaccination, and that is largely where we spend increasingly our money, girls' education. Your view of aid is actually quite old-fashioned. It's what we used to do 20 and 30 years ago. Now, aid is very focused on those things, and it's made a lot of progress.
That's what aid people have always claimed. That we used to do it badly, and now we do it well. People have been saying that for 6 decades. And
we did used to do it badly. We used to fund Mobutu. We used to prop up dictators.
And you're not doing it now?
No.
You're not doing it now? The Ethiopian regime? Well, even in India, let's take India, the example of the Prime Minister going to
you mentioned Ethiopia, let's take Ethiopia.
It's meant to be a debate.
But I'm happy to talk about Ethiopia too, but take India, for example, where it's not just a matter of the fact that the Indian government isn't particularly keen on it, but we put a fortune into education in India, much of which got stolen by local officials, as Indian government officials have admitted. So, I mean, it's...
Okay, let him speak now.
We should have zero tolerance for corruption. But we've also, in India, British aid has made a big difference. I mean,
it hasn't.
It has. Let me give you one example. So there's a man in the middle of India called Dr. Bang, and many years ago, with the support of British aid, he helped 39 villages reduce child mortality dramatically by just training one woman in each village to do 5 things. Now, many years later, as a result of that tiny intervention, it's being rolled out, that frontline health worker, those volunteer health workers, to 500 million Indians. That will save a lot of lives. Through a small intervention, you can have a big impact.
The point is not that no aid works. The point is that a lot of aid is wasteful, a lot of aid makes things worse, and there's a lack of transparency and accountability in the aid business, which makes aid waste inevitable.
How much of our aid budget is squandered?
It's difficult to know, but we have very rigorous auditing. Where we do agree is we should be transparent and we should tackle corruption.
But if we don't know, we're clearly not transparent.
Well, there are audits. I mean, you know, the British government and Justine Greening recently suspended aid to Uganda because of corruption. We stopped aid to Rwanda, where there is difficult places, but we also deliver aid in tough places, which are important for British interests, not this moral good, like Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I think it's actually a very good and cheap and cost-effective
Bill Gates says that cutting aid, quote, will do irreparable damage to global stability, to the growth of the global economy, and to the livelihood of millions of poor people. What do you say to Mr. Gates?
Say it's far more likely to do great harm to the livelihood of people in the aid industry. The 500,000 people around the world who are in this aid business, who carry on that business regardless of how well it does, and who are routinely dishonest about how much aid fails, how much goes into the pockets of the wrong people. And if you go to other countries, and I've lived in India for a long time, you find that people actually resent aid programs when those aid programs go into the pockets of local officials and corrupt business people.
Has any economy in the world or any country been transformed by aid?
lots in Africa. I mean, we've got double-digit growth in Africa
But
now.
what's that got to do with aid?
A lot. I mean, if you go to the remote, I was in Wollo, the centre of the famine many years ago in Ethiopia. You stand there. I stood in the market where Michael Burke broadcast from with dying children around him. It's a thriving market. The reason northern Wollo and southern Wollo have grown economically is because of roads, mobile phones, health clinics, education. Now, growth comes from private sector investment, but the reason the private sector have gone to Wollo is because the government, with
Are the
aid,
Chinese building these roads?
some of the roads, some of them by the European Union, but the Chinese also give aid. And I'm not saying aid by itself without growth. The tragedy of Jonathan's position is just when we're making dramatic progress to reduce child deaths, maternal mortality, he's building scepticism of aid.
The problem is that aid marketing tends to treat the public as idiotic, that we can't, you know, they're afraid that we won't give you the money if you actually admit how difficult things are, how much gets wasted. I mean, you look at, there's actually an inverse correlation between the most aided countries in economic growth. Somalia, Haiti, Nepal, absolute basket cases, the most aided countries in the world. And then you look at other countries that have had spectacular growth. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they did brilliantly without aid. And it's not necessarily causation, but it's certainly correlation.
I don't think that's true. I mean, countries in Africa that have done very well recently have had both private sector investment. I agree with you on that.
Somalia.
And I agree on...
Somalia's done... Well, Somalia has three mobile phone networks, which came, and they did that purely themselves, without any aid at all.
Somalia is many of the children die. I've just returned from Mogadishu, and, you know, nearly half the children are dying in Somalia, and they desperately need aid. That's an emergency situation, a conflict. But if we aren't investing in Somalia, it will be a conflict forever. And that's why aid is
investing would be good.
We're going to have to leave it there. I thank you both.
In disaster somewhere in the world, these boxes full of supplies get shipped out.
All of this could be used in programmes funded by the Department for International Development, and David Cameron's made clear that he sees foreign aid as a priority for his government. But should we be spending so much on it at a time of austerity?
Government spending on overseas aid has jumped from 8.7...
Now, David Cameron will be spending most of next week in India. He said last week that he likes his curries pretty hot. The main reason for his trip is to try and boost British business. The government now defines relations with India in terms of trade rather than aid. It announced last year that aid programmes to India would be phased out by 2015. Some critics have argued that was premature. Others question why the government is...
£1 billion last year to £11.3 billion this year. That's in line with its commitment to spend 0.7% of national income on aid by 2013, a UN target which the UK has now reached. But with countries like India, which has its own space programme on the receiving end of British aid, the Prime Minister has...
increasing an aid budget at all, overall, at a time of cuts in basic services at home. Susanna Mendonça has been weighing up the arguments.
Packed up and ready to go. This is Oxfam's Rapid Response Centre in Bicester, Oxfordshire. If there's a humanitarian, face calls from his own backbenchers to change course. In November, the government announced it would end all financial aid to India in 2015, a decision that left-leaning think tank IPPR has blamed on right-wing pressure. But one former Tory Chancellor says Britain needs to cut back.
Because we take this target seriously, we are giving more